This presentation touches on some of my PhD research concerning Australian practical legal training practitioners' engagement with the scholarship of teaching. In this presentation, I'll be talking about how I draw on the concept of bricolage in my research. Bricolage involves playful experiments with found objects or structures. It's a mutual confrontation of structure and accident. For me, it provides a framework for researching practical legal training practice, and I'll describe some structures first before I talk about my bricolage. My recent background is as a later-in-life lawyer. I practiced in commercial litigation and business law at a small regional firm before joining an Australian practical legal training college in Victoria as a lecturer and later as a senior lecturer and occasional academic leader. Presently I'm a full-time PhD student researching how Australian lawyers teaching PLT engage with scholarship of teaching. I will expand on this, but firstly a couple of comments about how I see practical legal training relates to clinical legal education. For those unfamiliar with the Australian scheme, the National Competency Standards for entry-level lawyers recommend practical legal training to be substantially completed as postgraduate training, and practical legal training is an eligibility requirement for admission to the profession. The Australian Best Practices for Clinical Legal Education report, released earlier this year, observes clinical legal education helps law students prepare for PLT. The behavioural learning outcomes specified for the Australian Bachelor of Laws degree are described as threshold learning outcomes. That's them on the right. Whereas the National Competency Standards operate as behavioural learning outcomes for practical legal training. They're on the left. In the past, I've compared the threshold learning outcomes with the National Competency Standards, thinking about the foundational intellectual competencies law graduates bring into practical legal training. I think that clinical legal education would help scaffold law students' learning as they progress from foundational intellectual legal skills training at law school to practical legal training. Clinical legal educators and PLT practitioners could be partners in a legal education continuum, and in that context my research might be relevant to clinical legal educators as well as PLT practitioners. In the Australian context, the legislation that mandates PLT identifies the protection of lawyers' clients, protection of the administration of justice, and the assurance of the quality of legal services as primary purposes. The state and territory admission boards are empowered to make rules regarding eligibility and suitability requirements for admission to the profession. They also approve or accredit PLT courses and providers. The admission boards are represented on the National Law Admissions Consultative Committee, which in turn prescribes the National Competency Standards for practical legal training, and those standards are incorporated by reference into the admission rules. Usually the Supreme Court is represented on the admission board consistent with the court's inherent power to control its officers, and in Australia we are admitted as lawyers and as officers of the court. We are taught our duty to the court is paramount and we must not mislead the court. Should PLT practitioners bear in mind the paramount duty when training and assessing law graduates' satisfactory completion of PLT? Could engagement with scholarship of teaching in PLT support PLT practitioners in this work? The phrase scholarship of teaching needs definition. Several have evolved over the last few decades, and you might be familiar with the work of Boyer and Glassick regarding scholarship and scholarship of teaching, and more recently writers such as Trigwell, Kreber, Lynch and others have worked towards researching and developing taxonomies for scholarship of teaching. I've reviewed about 50 items of literature on this topic, and I've identified key elements of scholarship of teaching in descending order of prominence as sharing scholarly work for external scrutiny, clear goals, self-reflection, knowledge, critical inquiry, discovery, appropriate preparation and methods, interdisciplinarity, analysis, application to practice, comparisons, intellectual engagement, and synthesis. Sharing, which is at the top of the list, is usually taken to mean peer-reviewed publication. However, new modes of transmission such as social media and new metrics for assessing impact might change this in the future. The review placed application to practice lower on the list. However, my impression from interviewing PLT practitioners is that they would prioritise application to practice over sharing for external scrutiny. In 2012, I informally surveyed scholarly publications for works involving Australian scholarship of teaching in PLT. I looked for outputs from 140 PLT practitioners from over a dozen PLT providers, and I found that a small number of practitioners engaged in scholarly activities around their teaching work and a small amount of literature shared for external scrutiny. At this stage, my impression is that many PLT practitioners have little time or motivation to engage with scholarship of teaching. Themes emerging from recent interviews include discomfort with theoretical approaches to teaching, variability in symbolic and actual organisational support, including time, and reluctance to expose what might be intellectual property in a competitive environment. I'll focus a little more on the first theme, discomfort with theory of teaching. During interviews, a majority of interviewees have expressed their disinclination to engage with theory of teaching and learning, especially if it is expressed in dense or difficult language and without obvious practical application. Well, I'm interested in both theory of teaching and action research driven by a practical philosophy. I might be at odds with my colleagues about theory, so part of my research involves uncovering different perspectives and possible implications. My perspective is that theory provides thinking tools for testing our assumptions, for designing research, and for communicating ideas to one another. If, as legal educators, we should contribute towards the protection of clients, the administration of justice, and the assurance of the quality of legal services, and we are to have meaningful discussions about how to do this, then teaching and learning theory is relevant and useful. So I'm exploring how Australian PLT practitioners engage with scholarship of teaching. Do they have motivation and/or capacity to engage with scholarly activities around teaching work? Do PLT practitioners believe their employers symbolically support and/or allocate actual resources towards scholarly activities around teaching work? In relation to questions about motivation and capacity to engage, I'm interested in whether these are constrained by dispositions that legal education, legal training and practice inculcates in lawyers. For example, experiential learning designs that simulate practice seem to be prized by students, practitioners, employers and the profession as authentic. Prominent educators, practitioners and students support the effectiveness of experiential learning. However, if the instructional design incorporates entrenched beliefs and practices held to be self-evidently valid, the design might be superbly adapted for reproduction, but resistant to fresh insights from research and scholarship. If notions of authenticity based on educational and practice experiences from the last century guide course accreditation, what does that mean for contemporary practical legal training? In my research, I decided to draw on a multi-perspective approach to theory and methodology, including my experience as a lawyer, practical legal training practitioner and 20 years acting experience. As an actor, I used creative and technical approaches that combined interpretation of text, stagecraft and improvised performance, and that might have set up my appreciation for the concept of bricolage. Levi-Strauss's concept of bricolage argues beliefs and practices are remembered and organised through folklore and rituals that can be playfully reorganised to produce new solutions to problems. He saw bricolage as one of two distinct but equally valid modes of scientific thought, operating at a strategic level adapted to perception and imagination, in contrast to a detached objectivist approach. It involves a creative process within a framework of structure and accident. It consists of interacting with a subject or materials or a prospective consumer, not just observing it. In other words, bricolage is a dynamic dialogue with the materials and the means of execution. And this dynamic dialogue appears with lawyers in practice, teachers in teaching, and in research. We see it in sports, arts, court work, dispute resolution, and teaching moments. It exists within and without the rules. It is an approach that involves reflection and reflexivity. It recognises that learning from mistakes is powerful and fundamental. One aspiration for my research is to adopt an approach that experiments with theories, methodologies, and methods to achieve both coherence and innovation through bricolage. It sounds terribly theoretical, so how might it actually work? I'll quickly describe my methods, then draw back to methodological and theoretical aspects. My data collection involves documents and semi-structured interviews with PLT practitioners. The documents include legislation that mandate PLT, the relevant rules, regulations, practice directions and guidelines. Public documents produced by PLT providers, mission statements, policies concerning teaching and learning, academic staff profiles, reports and marketing material, and documents produced by admission boards and national legal and higher education bodies. The semi-structured interviews involve 36 PLT practitioners from 6 states and territories, and they are affiliated with several PLT providers. The documents and interview recordings are imported into qualitative data analysis software used to store, organise, categorise and help analyse the data. The documents are treated as representing objective structures that delineate the boundaries of the PLT field. The data from semi-structured interviews is treated as subjective because of subjective positions of the interviewer and the interviewees. And at first I thought I would compare what the documents disclose about organisations' espoused positions concerning scholarship and teaching with the interviewees' reported practices. I became dissatisfied with that approach. It was too superficial to gain insights about forces that might influence the positions of organisations and individuals in the field. Also, I became interested in exploring ways to reconcile objective and subjective aspects of the study. And this leads me to the theoretical tools that I find useful for thinking with. For example, Bourdieu identifies education systems existing in and outside primary to tertiary education. Education systems operate to inculcate dispositions in organisational and individual agents, and these unconscious dispositions tend to preserve structures and reproduce practices where agents play the game to acquire categories of capital of value in the field. And being a lawyer has a certain social capital, and being judge has a certain symbolic capital. And in the context of PLT, I find these tools useful to think about how legal education, training, admission processes and practices might be both products and producers of practitioners' dispositions. But do PLT practitioners have agency? Do they go along or do they resist dominant structures? De Soto suggests people use tactics to resist dominant strategies as part of practice in everyday life. Tactics can involve diversions, misappropriations, and creative turns. To use an everyday example, the desire paths that people create as they traverse the gridwork of city streets might be interpreted as a form of resistance. Maybe student plagiarism is another example. In some recent interviews, PLT practitioners have described interactions around decisions to pass borderline students in terms that suggest dominant strategies and tactics of resistance. Theoretical tools are useful for generating insights from data. For example, the interview question, "Is thinking like a lawyer different from thinking like a teacher?" provokes interesting responses that might be taken at face value. However, analysing the responses from theoretical perspectives yields insights that add texture to understanding PLT practitioners' engagement with teaching theory and practice. Data does not necessarily behave. Early analysis might disclose concepts and themes that demand the theoretical framework be revised. This requires theoretical sensitivity, a concept connected to grounded theory and involves awareness of explicit and emergent approaches to sense-making. It is demanding. It urges on you an open-minded approach that involves study across and at the edges of other disciplines. It underscores the necessity of a reflective and reflexive approach to researching practice. Part way through my semi-structured interviews, the data collected so far suggests that PLT practitioners are impatient with the type of theoretical approach I've described here. Practitioners, understandably, express a preference for concise statements about what works in teaching, and as a PLT practitioner I acknowledge and respect that practitioners have little time to read and understand theoretical work. On the other hand, adopting concise statements about what works in the classroom involves blind faith if there is little critical engagement with the scholarship underlying those statements. I think that PLT practitioners need symbolic and substantive support to motivate them and improve their capacity to engage in scholarly activities around PLT teaching work. And perhaps Bricolage provides a more flexible conceptual framework that could encourage engagement with research and scholarship of teaching in PLT. I suspect that heightened engagement with scholarship of teaching would improve practitioners' engagement with their work. It could raise the standing of practical legal training and improve the contribution that practical legal training makes to protection of clients, the administration of justice, and the assurance of the quality of legal services. You can learn more about my work via the Plegal Trainer blog. Just search on Plegal Trainer in your search engine and I'm sure you'll find me.